Welcome to A Hero for Our Times, Saint Joan of Arc's Image and Legacy in the Public Square. My name is Jennifer Paxton, and I am the director of the University Honors Program at the Catholic University of America and a member of the Department of History. The Honors Program is very delighted today to partner with the Institute for Human Ecology. The Institute for Human Ecology exists to educate university students, to give the Republic her best citizens, to sponsor multidisciplinary academic research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events encouraging conversation between the Academy and the public square. Today's conversation is a preview of what the IHE graduate students will be learning this June at the Civitas Dei Fellowship, the theme of which is Art, Meaning, and the Public Square. More importantly, it is also a conversation in honor of Saint Joan of Arc's feast day this Sunday, May 30th. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I want to take the prerogative of the moderator to say a few words about the historical context for Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc is known, of course, for her activity during the 100 Years' War between England and France. So why was there a 100 Years' War? Well, it came about because of a disaster in the French dynasty in 1328 when they ran out of legitimate male heirs. So the three sons of Philip IV of France all died without sons. And what were they going to do next? He had a daughter, Isabella, who married the English king Edward II and produced a son, Edward III. But of course, the French nobles were not in the least bit interested in being ruled by an English king. So they went further up the dynastic tree to the family of Philip IV's brother, Charles of Valois, and that is how we get the Valois dynasty. So Philip VI takes over in 1328. Well, when Edward III comes of age, he decides to prosecute his genealogical claim to the French throne, and that is how you get the 100 Years' War. Now, it went up and down over the rest of the 14th century. I will not trouble you with that. I will get us all the way up to the early 15th century, right before Joan of Arc. And at this point, we have poor Charles VI of France on the throne, who unfortunately was mentally unstable. He suffered from the delusion that he was made of glass and that if you touched him, he might break. Of course, as a result of that, there needed to be a regency. Somebody else really needed to run France, and there was a dispute between different branches of the French royal family over who would actually control affairs in France. The two branches were the family of the Duke of Orléans and the family of the Duke of Burgundy. And so you have a conflict between the Orleanist party, or the Armagnacs, and the Burgundians. So you have a civil war in France within these two branches of the French royal family. They carry out assassinations. So this is the assassination of the Duke of Orléans in 1407. And so this is not a very good time to have the war revived by the appearance on the scene of Henry V of England, of course, and we know from various depictions of Shakespeare's play, of course, the most famous one recently being the one with Kenneth Branagh. So Henry V takes the throne, he revives the war in France, he wins the famous Battle of Agincourt, but that battle really isn't what turns the tide for the English. The thing that does it is when the fight between the two warring factions of the French royal family breaks out again in 1419. This time the Duke of Burgundy is assassinated, and his faction says, right, we're not having that, and they take the English side. So now the English actually have half of the French on their side, and that allows them to make an agreement in 1420 whereby the English basically capture the French throne. There's a marriage between Henry V of England and the French princess, Katharine. And they produce a son, Henry VI of England, who takes the throne at age 9 months. So Henry V dies of dysentery, and now we have little Henry VI of England, in theory at least, king of both England and France. But there is a French heir to the throne still out there, Charles VII, as he is not yet. He's still just the Dauphin, which is the title for the heir apparent in France. And he is keeping alive the French claim to the French throne. Okay. Then we get to the end of the 1420s, and you can see from the map on the left there that the purple territory is what the English control, the dark purple territory is what their Burgundian allies control, and they have a border fortress, Orléans, where they're really trying to hold the line against the English, because if the English take Orléans, they could really just roll south and carry off all of the rest of the French-held territory. Enter our star of the day, Joan of Arc. Okay, so Joan appears, she comes from a little village called Domremy, which you can see on the map, close to the border with the Holy Roman Empire in the east. Domremy was a village with French sympathies, although it was close to the Burgundian territory. And so Joan decides that she, hearing some voices that tell her to, she is going to rescue the French cause. And so the white line you see on the map is the route that she takes from her little village, Domremy, to the French royal court in Chinon. This is where they're holding out. And she convinces the French king to let her fight. And so off they go to Orléans, which they hold the line in Orléans. They defeat the English there. And then you can see the blue line on the map is the route from Orléans to Reims, because Reims is where Charles is finally crowned King Charles VII. This is the traditional site of coronation for French kings. Basically, if they're not crowned at Reims, they're not kings of France. And so this is a huge turn in the fortunes of the French, and they basically never look back after that. And you can see on this slide the person holding the flag at the top of the stained glass window is actually Joan in male attire, about which I'm sure Dr. Heimann will speak more. The following year, though, Joan was captured by the Burgundians. The Burgundians then had a choice of what to do with her. They offered to ransom her back to the French, and the French king refused to pay. And historians have speculated that at that point, he felt like he had gotten all that he could from her, and that basically her continued existence was a little bit of a threat to his manhood, so to speak, because he had not been able to accomplish all of these great feats without her, and so he wasn't interested in getting her back. So the Burgundians then sell her to the English, their allies. The English, of course, are very interested in getting rid of Joan, and she is put on trial for heresy and burned at the stake the following year. All right, and that is as far as I want to take the story now, because I want to hear, as all of you do, from Dr. Heimann. I want to remind you before I introduce her that you can submit your questions to the Q&A box. Please do so at any time. We'll get them and then we'll answer them at the end. We're going to transition to Q&A at around 12:40, so there'll be plenty of time to answer your questions. But now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Nora Heimann, who is an associate professor and chair of the art department here at Catholic. She is a specialist in European and American modern and contemporary art history, and in the relationship between art, religion, and national identity. Her work experience includes curating exhibitions at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in DC, at the Knights of Columbus Museum in New Haven, and the Chapin Rare Book Library in Williamstown. And she has worked for curatorial and education departments at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Museum of Art, and the Städtische Sammlung Schweinfurt in Germany. Her publications include 2 books, Joan of Arc, Her Image in France and America, and Joan of Arc in French Art and Culture, 1700 to 1855, From Satire to Sanctity, as well as a variety of exhibition catalog entries and articles on European and American art from the 19th to the 21st centuries. And I should add, as a personal note, she is also my dear colleague. and has taught several courses in the University Honors Program, and I hope will do so again. Without further ado, Dr. Nora Heimann.
Thank you very much. Let me cue up my presentation. What we'll be talking about today is Joan of Arc as an image of heroism and as an image of a hero for our times. So we'll be taking on that question today. Is she indeed a hero for our times? And I'd like to argue that she is. Let's discuss why. So what I'm hoping is that this will work. Hang on, here we go. Can you all see my, Dr. Paxton, can you see my presentation? It looks like
I can.
I was having a little bit of trouble earlier today. So where I'd like to begin is by just giving a basic little bit of background on Joan of Arc and how we know her. There's only one image that survives of her from her own lifetime. We're looking at a reproduction of it from the margins of the Register of the Parliament of Paris in 1429, drawn in May. It's basically a doodle, probably from a bored scribe, but named de Fauconberg. But it's an image that we know has no bearing on reality. It's not what Joan of Arc looked like. We know she had short hair. We know she dressed as a man. These are extremely well documented and fill many scores of pages in her very long trial transcripts, which are why we know more, as much or more about her than we do about many of the monarchs of the Middle Ages. Her trial transcripts exist. There are multiple copies of them still today, but this gives us the opportunity to imagine her in our own way. So how do we indeed imagine her? How do we imagine Joan of Arc? Hang on, let's see if this is working. This is not. Hang on. Let me try sharing my screen again. Here we go. Is this working? Can you guys all see? Jenny, can you see this image now?
We can see it. We do see your slides along the bottom as well.
Okay, that is not the, hang on. I am still having technical difficulties. Let's try this again. Here we go. There. Is that better?
That is better. Perfect.
All right. Very good. So we can ask ourselves, if we want to think of her as an heroic figure, which I think many of us do, how do we imagine her in that way? Is she something like a figure for a Wheaties cereal box? Is she an inspired visionary, as so many imagined her in the 19th century? This is a sculpture and a painting, but I could show you literally 100 more wonderful paintings and sculptures of her from the 19th century. Do we imagine her as something like Christ or something like Mary? She sort of is a mashup of the two of them in one of the most ubiquitous World War I memorials that you can see in France. These are all over France, of Joan of Arc, often holding a soldier who's died in battle, surrounded by a kind of martyr's wreath of crown of thorns or a cross, but this is one example in Les Balles by Maxime Réal d'Arsart. Or do we imagine her, and I think probably the majority of us today don't, but there was a following for this as a kind of fearless idiot, as a woman that was ridiculous. And that was very much the way that Voltaire saw her, the 18th century satirist. This is one of the ways in which he describes her. I think of Joan not as an inspired innocent, but as a fearless idiot who believed herself to be inspired, a village heroine who had a great role thrust upon her, a hardy girl whom the inquisitors and doctors sent to the stake with the utmost cruelty. It is kind of ironic, two things about Joan of Arc and Voltaire. One is that they both happen to die on the same day. I think sometimes that God has a sense of humor. But that his ironic satire, and he did a political satire that was literally one of the most banned and burned books of the 18th century, with Joan of Arc as his kind of ironic heroine. She is described as the last woman of virtue in France, and having to preserve her virtue is the escapade. And there's sort of one hilarious, ridiculous, insulting, and obscene escapade after another in this in his poem that forced him into exile, actually, from France, and almost got him thrown into prison. It was a big deal in its day. But do we, we could also imagine her as a witch and a strumpet who conjures up fiends from hell. This is the way she is imagined in the British Chronicles. It's the way that William Shakespeare envisages her. It's the way in which William Hamilton, the history painter, paints her. She's literally in this scene kind of drawing demons from hell, and it is their intervention that tips the balance for the French. Now, we can begin to imagine as we look at this, these images and read or watch Henry VI, Part 1, not performed that often, or read our Holinshed, that the British had a reason why they might want to show Joan of Arc looking like she's a woman without virtue, and that the French won only because they consorted with demons. It's a kind of great way to explain why they lost when they outnumbered the French in certain ways and held, really important strongholds and had really crucial allies in France. So, there's a lot to Joan of Arc's life story. How shall we imagine her? In her condemnation, she is captured in battle and put on trial in front of about 100 prelates and scholars, most of them drawn from the University of Paris, which was the leading theological center in the 15th century. And the trial went on for many, many months. I've already alluded to the fact that these trial transcripts still exist. You can see them in facsimile. The originals are in London, Paris. There's six complete intact trial transcripts. Two in London, I think, two in Paris, one at least in Orléans. But as we can see, I've put in just a kind of excerpt of what she was accused of being a temptress, of being credulous, of being superstitious, of being a prophetess and a blasphemer, a transgressor of divine law. The list is really long. Your hard-heartedness and your refusal to submit are what they tell her in the end, are the reasons for her condemnation to death. And here is a slide that indicates that the trial transcripts are, we can number both the trial of her condemnation, but also the trial of her rehabilitation. And in the trial of her rehabilitation we have, which is where they sought to overturn the conviction. When you're convicted of heresy, the only way to overturn that is to have a second inquisition. And they held a second inquisition after Reims was no longer a Burgundian stronghold. It was no longer English in its sentiments, where the original trial was held. And the trial transcripts get evoked then in the retrial, the rehabilitation trial, that was held because her mother personally, Joan of Arc's surviving mother, personally intervened with the Pope and was persistent. She was not going to take no for an answer. And in the end, there literally are hundreds of people that were interviewed, all of her neighbors, her childhood friends, everyone in the family that still lived, all of her priests, all of her confessors, her closest associates. Now, these trial transcripts really don't become widely available until the 19th century, which is a part of this interest in history that rebounds in the 19th century in archivally based research. But they give us, and we still have access to them now, as these transcripts were translated from the medieval Latin and the medieval French into modern French and then later modern English. We get a tremendous insight into Joan of Arc and her life. And, we can see, for example, the testimony of her contemporaries that spoke to her good temper and her good values. She was a good, sweet girl, said her neighbor Ovette. I believe she was sent by God, said Dunois, her companion at arms. She was, in my opinion, a good Catholic, and all that she did was godly, spoke another companion at arms. So, so the witnesses on her behalf trial transcripts can be read as well. And in the end, her condemnation about 25 years after she was condemned was declared null and void, baseless and politically motivated. And I think that's how historians frankly see it today as well. But how does she come to be a saint? It takes a very, very long time. Push begins in the 1850s, gains continued ground. There was a particular man, Felix Dupanloup, the bishop of Orléans, is spearheads it, but dies of cancer. And the kind of lancet gets taken up by other French prelates. She's declared venerable in 1904, beatified in 1909, and then things just stall out. Whether Joan of Arc, I think, is regarded by the French, both popularly, even by people that don't have no, are profoundly secular, is regarded in many ways as a heroic figure. But whether or not she's a heroic figure worthy of canonization is a big debate, and it makes for quite fascinating reading. The advocacy of the devil's advocate against Joan of Arc is why Joan of Arc was not canonized until 1920. So 6 centuries separate her life and death, and we're looking at some early images. These are both posthumous, 1848, she dies in 1431, so about 50 years after she dies. Maréchal d'Auvergne's Vigile du Roi Charles VII. This is an illustrated edition, a very beautifully illuminated edition, and we're looking at 2 pictures from it. It takes 6 centuries before, in fact, she becomes canonized. And we can get into why she's canonized more later, but let's stick to the topic at hand, which is Joan of Arc a heroine for today? Being canonized says she's a woman of heroic virtue. That's by definition what it is to be canonized. It is to be declared by the Catholic Church heroic in your virtue. But is she a heroine for us? How does she speak to us today? Well, let's stop by asking ourselves what a hero is, right? What do we mean when we think of a hero? And if we look at sort of the historical context, the Greeks, we might as well start with them because they're the guys that invent the word hero. Regarded a hero as an individual, and in Greek terms was usually a demigod, someone that was part mortal, part divine, that was endowed with great courage and whose life becomes celebrated for their noble exploits. It's usually a he, so I'm using the masculine pronoun here. Celebrated for his noble exploits, willing to sacrifice his life for a purpose, who becomes honored after death for his extraordinary achievements. The Homeric hero Theseus, for example, is remembered for his many daring exploits, most particularly saving Athens by slaying the Minotaur. And Joan, I mention this in part because, let's kind of go to our origins if we ask what heroes are, but just note that as people have sought across the centuries, and even in her own day, to make sense of how a simple girl from the countryside, I've been to Domremy 3 times, getting there takes a full day. You can drive there. It is the easternmost frontier of France, or you can take the train, in which it'll still take a full day because there's no direct train. It's very remote and tiny little town. And she never learned to read or write. How does a girl like that go and convince the Dauphin in exile to give her an army and let her save France? And one of the theories, it's a very common theory that is widely disbelieved by historians, is that she might have been the bastard child of a king. Of course, he's going to make time for her. She's his, kind of illegitimate half-sister. That was one of the theories that got talked about even in her own trial. I think it makes it sort of all the more remarkable that Joan of Arc accomplished what she did, given that she is not, unlike Theseus, half divine, half born of a goddess. But what do we think of as heroic today? Forgive me for misspelling the word do. Do we think of as heroic today? I think we think of figures of courageous self-sacrifice, as we saw it in battles in a war and 9/11, struggles for Black Lives Matter, handicapped individuals that have struggled to make great accomplishments despite their disabilities. I think these are all things that are very commonly regarded as heroic. And if we want to think of these things, courageous self-sacrifice, moral courage, and physical courage, in many ways, Joan of Arc does fit these descriptions. You know, if we take up, for example, physical courage, and I'll give you just one instance, there's more than one instance I could cite for you. Joan of Arc, rather famously, at this really climactic moment, Siege of Orléans, as Dr. Paxton has already pointed out, in many ways was a kind of watershed moment in the 100 Years' War. Think of the River Loire, which basically runs kind of like a belt across the center of France, you know, literally the very center, and Orléans is, was in the 1400s the second largest city in France on the Loire River. It kind of controlled the flow of that river, and in many ways determined a kind of frontier between the Anglo-Burgundians and those that were loyal to the Valois prince, Dauphin, who becomes King Charles after Joan helps to bring him to Reims for being crowned. You know, in this kind of crucial moment, one, you know, and I won't get into the weeds here, but she brings the army to approach from a side that they didn't expect, from the stronger side. They were anticipating that she might try and approach from the north, which would be easier, and instead approaches from the south, harder to get to, easier to be seen, all kinds of reasons why a southern approach was not anticipated. And in battle, literally kind of scrambling on the ramparts when Joan of Arc is trying to lift the siege of Orléans by lifting the strong head on the Loire River. There's an island in the middle of the river where there was where there were two fortifications. She's struck in the chest. It's described in some accounts as the neck, in some as the chest, in some as the neck and the chest. Eyewitnesses give a variety of accounts. She's struck by the bolt of a crossbow and falls and is stunned and is carried away. And the British see this as their moment, and they let out a roar, and the French just think this is their moment to lose, and they all fall back. They had had momentum. Joan of Arc goes back. She's offered amulets and various tokens of things that would help her change her luck and survive. You know, this is an age before antibiotics, before portable wound dressings. She slapped some, apparently slapped some animal fat on the wound, had it bound up, put her armor back on, got on her horse, rode back out there, and entered the fray again. And the British literally were astonished. They fell back in complete astonishment. They thought she was dead. They didn't think she'd get up. They didn't think she'd come back, nor for that matter did the French. And in many ways, this gives them a momentum. They take the fortress because the British are just like, what's going on here? And the battle goes on for another day, but or 2 days, I believe, at the time that she was wounded. I think she was wounded on the 7th, and it's not until the 8th that they enter Orléans. But it's strategically crucial, and she'll rally again after being wounded similarly in the battle for Paris, a battle that she did not win. So if we want to ask, was she a physically courageous person? Yes, she was. If we want to ask ourselves, was she someone that was morally courageous, if that's a value that we might also seek? And we see again and again when we read her trial transcripts that with a great deal of humility and yet with a great deal of conviction, she is willing to, at times with almost a sense of humor, respond to her judges that seem quite determined to trip her up, you know, to catch her in a false sense of pride, to catch her in a sense of her having been miraculously, divinely inspired. And her insistence is that the miraculous inspiration is God's, and that the divine inspiration doesn't lie within herself, but in the voices that speak to her. And then they probe her on her voices. Who are they, and what do they look like, and how are they dressed? And there are these wonderful responses that she offers them as well. Like when she indicates that Saint Michael, Saint Katharine, and Saint Marguerite were her inspirations, her voices that spoke to her. When asked how they appeared, was he naked? You know, she refuses to respond whether or not he had a haircut. She says, don't you think God could cut his hair? Responding whether or not he was clothed or not. She's, don't you think that God has the wherewithal to clothe him? I mean, she's really, she's very calm in the face of adversity. When we see what happens to her at the very, very end of her life, I think this is where the message of her life for us today perhaps becomes timely, maybe. That's how it feels for me anyway. She was brought at the very, very end. I think the French realized that they may have had grounds for heresy for a variety of reasons that are not, that, you know, are, if you read the Devil's Advocate's remark, the promoter of the faith's remarks in his report in the early 20th century saying we should not canonize Joan of Arc, he cites a number of things that she did, and we can get into them or not as to why maybe she shouldn't have been canonized after all. But they realize they really can't, she seems to be acting in good faith. They really can't, she's not an unrepentant heretic. So the way that they catch her out, because it's really, you cannot necessarily burn someone for heresy, you can really only condemn someone mortally for a heresy that is unrepentant. They bring her literally to the cemetery of Saint Joan, tell her, you will be buried here today if you don't sign these papers saying that you subject yourselves to our will and you recant some of the things that you've said. She signs the papers, and she says later that she did so because she was afraid of fire, and is brought back to her. She's promised verbally, according to many accounts, that she'll be permitted to be given to the care of women, and that she will be permitted to receive communion. And when she neither receives communion nor is given to the care of women, she's found wearing men's clothing again. And wearing men's clothing was one of the things that they kept raising again and again during her trial. And when she refuses, when they ask her why she's put men's clothing back on again, she said, I realized I have to tell the truth. God did speak to me through saints, and I can't deny it any longer, and I'd rather die than lie and tell a falsehood. And she's buried. She's burned and then buried, actually not buried, burned, and then her ashes are thrown into the Seine within 3 days. It's a very, very rapid condemnation and death. But I think, you know, how is that an example for us? I mean, it actually sounds sort of awful. I think on the one hand, her frailty, her fear is one that I think anybody could understand, but that she would realize that even in her fear, she may have done the wrong thing, and then tries to do the right thing and is willing to face any consequence rather than no longer tell the truth again and no longer bear witness to what she knows is right, is what I think makes her, in these times when it's sometimes very hard to stand up for what you believe in. As a Catholic, as a Christian, as someone politically active with a sense of what is right and wrong. I mean, I think we can find many examples today where where it can be a tremendous challenge, and we may not be perfect at it. Joan of Arc was certainly not perfect, and she was, among others, you know, in her trial transcripts makes it clear she was perfectly willing to admit that. But she had, in the end, to say what she knew was right and had to do what she knew was right. And so it's on those grounds that I offer her to you today as a hero for our times.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heimann. You've given us lots to think about. And so I thought I would start off with a couple of questions. One of my questions has to do with the way in which Joan of Arc intersects with French national identity. Because, you know, we're talking today specifically about how we might take Joan as a hero, but how has she seemed heroic at other times and places? So specifically, how have the French treated her as a hero?
Well, in keeping this short, because there's a lot of history that could be covered in that. In our own day, and in the day of our parents and grandparents, and sort of like within the last generation or so, Joan of Arc has been seen as a really crucial rallying figure. Charles de Gaulle, for example, adopts the sword of Lorraine, the cross of Lorraine, as his symbol, in part because he really adores Joan of Arc's example, her courage, her willingness against all odds to take up the cause of France and a unified France. That's one way. I think if we look a little further back, if we look back to the late 19th century, for example, after the Franco-Prussian War, where France lost the territories that included Joan of Arc's birthplace, Joan becomes really a symbol of the need to reunify France and of France's need to strengthen itself. But Joan of Arc becomes a really interesting symbol during World War I and World War II for Americans, for British, for French. She is a figure that we'll see carved by soldiers into gun casings and this kind of war trench art that gets made in World War I. She appears on flags. The Knights of Columbus organized rallies and trips to Domremy in both World War I and World War II. I think she's seen as really a very important figure. I think more recently, there have been a number of political figures, some quite pejoratively. Neo-fascists in France have very much adopted Joan of Arc as a symbol of the extreme right. And I think the left has sought to reclaim her at various times. Ségolène Royal famously carries a bouquet of flowers. She was a leftist candidate for the presidency in France. Socialist, and carried an enormous bouquet of flowers to her memory. So long-winded answer. And last, I'll offer is, of course, the ways in which she's been seen as a symbol for suffragettes in America and France and England, for women, for women's rights, frankly. But yeah.
Well, she seems to have appealed to many people from different perspectives at different times. And just I'll add one last thing, which is that it's remarkable to me to see how the English adopted Joan during the First World War, because of course, you already talked about the very negative portrayal of Joan in Shakespeare, which would have been, in terms of literary representations, what most English people would have been familiar with. But there's a real sea change when the English and the French are suddenly allies against the Germans, and the English are quite happy to adopt Joan as their heroine as well. At that point. And the negative view of Joan has disappeared now completely in Britain. Nobody really, and as you mentioned, the Henry VI Part 1 play is rarely performed, and I think one of the reasons why is because the audience can't cope with the negative portrayal of Joan of Arc. It's just very alienating.
I agree.
So we've gotten a number of really interesting questions from the audience. One of our participants has asked, is it true that the Dominicans tried Joan of Arc? So what can you tell us about who tried her?
Order. I think Cochon, who was the lead, the manager of the trial, basically the chief judge, was himself a Dominican, I believe. But she herself had, I think she had a Dominican confessor. So I don't think the Dominicans can carry all the weight of responsibility. I think in many ways they brought Joan of Arc solace and acknowledged her sanctity sooner than anyone else. I mean, not necessarily more than anyone else, but famously the man that served as her confessor, because it was among the people in the audience when she died. It held up a cross for her to give her comfort as she was burned at the stake. And as people shouted, "We burned a saint," so yeah. What else? Yeah, other questions.
So one of our participants asks about the biography of Joan of Arc written by Mark Twain.
Yeah, that's
one of many fictional representations of Joan, if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, for Twain, and as for Barnard Shaw, I mean, I think those make for interesting comparisons, both of them. Joan of Arc seemed to have had a very personal meaning for both of those men. In the case of Mark Twain, which, and the first time you read it, if you've read much Mark Twain, you might expect, he's a humorist. Usually, he writes with a tremendous sense of fun, and it's quite a serious book in many ways. It's not its usual light satire, but he'd lost a daughter who died as a child and not long before, and he thought of her as he wrote Joan of Arc. And he was really, I think, trying to capture a crucial archetype in the 19th century of the virtuous child, and in particular, the virtuous feminine child. I mean, there's all sorts of examples in Victorian literature and in art. and in painting and in American literature of the same time period, the innocent child. And I think that's a part of why Joan of Arc catches the imagination in the 18th and 19th, well, in particular in the 19th century. I mean, Joan of Arc catapults to fame in the 19th century. She's a relative, she's a regional heroine. She's known about, she's discussed in, you know, she appears among the 9 worthy women at times, an archetype that we'll see in tapestries in the 17th century and the 18th century. In prints and engravings and paintings, but she's not that famous. She's not like in the annual exhibitions that are held in the 19th century. There are literally sometimes 20 paintings and works of art, sculptures of Joan of Arc appearing year after year after year. It's like a major theme. And I think a part of that is that she represents the rural in a time of urbanization. She represents childhood innocence. And I think for Mark Twain, she represents some of both of those things too. Yeah, it's an interesting read.
Thank you very much. And I'll just add on that you mentioned the 9 worthy women. Pretty much the first literary work that refers to Joan of Arc is written before she even dies. This is the famous Titier by Christine de Pisan, the Italian-born but really, you know, French by affiliation poet, very feminist poet for her age. And she writes an encomium to Joan in which she says that Joan is better than the 9 male worthies. She's actually better than Hector and Achilles. So she's getting a good press there at the very start.
The refrain that Christine de Pizan uses is what honor for the feminine sex. She really sees Joan as an example of how women can do anything. Women can be as courageous as any man and can change history. And, you know, we can see Joan as an example of that for sure.
We have a question from our colleague, Susan Timoney. Is there a devotional cult rooted in Joan of Arc? So are there traditions of intercession to Joan?
So in her own day, I mean, since the question comes from a medievalist, I should, from a historian, let's ground it in history and say, in her own lifetime, there were people that sought her to heal a sick child, for example. And Joan of Arc very famously was willing to visit that child, but said, I'm not going to heal this child. My touch is not a healing touch. She was quite insistent. And that was something that came up later in her trial. You know, was she someone that claimed for herself miraculous powers? Was she, in fact, you know, some demonic in that sense? And Joan really refused that. But a cult very much grows up around her, not so much in her own day, but very much in the 19th century. And we'll see figures like Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux, Saint Teresa of the Little Flower, and of the Holy Face of Jesus, very much seeing Joan of Arc as an inspiration. And she wrote poems and plays and performed in them and photographed herself as Joan of Arc. And there are the requisite miracles that do indeed appear that are necessary for her canonization. So yes, there is, but it's a much more modern phenomenon, frankly. Yeah.
Well, we've had such a wonderful comment in the chat, prefacing this participant's question, that I feel like I need to read it aloud. My wife and I were married in a church named in her honor, and I have a serious devotion to her, in part because she teaches a certain lesson that I think very fitting for humble democratic citizenship. With God's help, even the simple can do great good for the common good of one's country. Add to this the lovely lesson that God loves our love of country, rightly understood, and cooperates with us to help our nations to peace and prosperity. Right? That's wonderful.
Brilliantly put.
And this participant asks if you have read the novel by Pamela Marcantel, An Army of Angels.
I own it. I started it. I never finished it. Do you recommend it? Should I go back to it?
Well, it might be worth looking into. Yeah. So we've had a follow-up question about our references to Shakespeare. Isn't Shakespeare's depiction sarcastically ironic, since his depiction was so obviously overdone in contradiction to the historical record. The bard has done this in a number of contexts. Now, I will jump in and say that the ways in which Joan is defamed in the play are historical. So those are some of the exact ways in which she was accused of transgression during her lifetime. So it is historically accurate in that it was historic fake news. So she's accused of potentially having relationships with various people, so she's not chaste after all, and so of pleading at the end of her life that she was pregnant so that she wouldn't be executed. This is completely not true. There's no reference to this in the trial transcripts whatsoever. Could that have been overdone? Certainly, because Shakespeare is always operating on more than one level at once.
Yes, I think so. But if you read the trial transcripts, and there are large sections of them that are accessible online now, and lots of published editions. So you can check them out from the library. I mean, they're out there. Many editions. It's clear that her accusers know all these stories, or many of them, and repeat them to her and ask her to try and prove how they aren't true. And so that the accusation that she called forth for demonic help, the accusation that she was promiscuous and unvirtuous, and the list goes on, that those were contemporaneous accusations. They were. And a part of what makes for interesting reading and reading the trial transcripts is how she responds, and also reading the Rehabilitation, where, kind of contemporary after contemporary that really knew her says, no, that's really not true. Yeah.
Very good question. Here's a question. I read that when Joan of Arc sought out the Dauphin for the first time, he disguised himself, but she knelt before him anyway and asked for his backing to help her join in battle. Was this folklore or a recorded fact?
Well, I don't think she ever expected him to come into battle with her. And he was sort of famously, I mean, I don't mean to slander the guy. I think he was seen by a lot of contemporaries and by historians as someone that was perfectly happy enjoying life in relative obscurity and comfort. Well, some others were willing to give their lives to try and restore his monarchy. But yes, that is a really famous account that it gets brought up in her trial and is told again and again, of how when she went to Chinon to see the king, the Dauphin, he wasn't a king, to see the prince, he hid himself among the courtiers and kind of shoved forward another one of the peers that was fancier dressed than he was on the occasion, presenting someone else as the prince. And she famously said, no, you're not the prince, you are the prince. And then said, I have something I want to say to you, and famously gave him some kind of confidence that God had supposedly given her. And this is, Voltaire plays with this. There's all sorts of speculation as to what she in fact had to say to him. And we don't know. She refuses to divulge what that was in her trial when they press her to say, what was it that she said to the Dauphin that made him trust you? And of course, it wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't like she said, no, you're an imposter, you're the prince, and I got a secret I'll whisper in his ear and it's done. The prince then was willing to listen to her, and he gave her over to judges and learned men to basically examine her. That was sort of one of her first of many examinations, where they want to know, are you for real? And that goes on for many days. And at the end of it, they come back and say, she seems for real and we should go for it. But yeah, great question.
I think I'll follow up on that and ask, why do you think, and I don't know the answer to this either, why do you think they followed her?
Well, I think there's probably a bunch of reasons. One of them is success engenders success. I mean, it didn't come to her right away. She's very persistent, and there's a moral in that too. Don't give up. Just keep trying, have conviction. And so, she goes to Robert de Baudricourt, the local nobleman, to get a lift, basically, to meet the prince again and again and again and again. And he sends her back, usually with insults like, just go back to your dad and just, behave. And she keeps going. God has a mission for her, and finally convinces him to give her a horse. And then de Baudricourt's vassals pay personally for her. The community rises up to give her a suit of armor, and then a bunch of people volunteer to go with her. And they just sort of, as she inspires more and more individuals to believe in her, and are impressed more and more with how she is inspiring others. And how does she inspire them? Well, I think in part through her conviction. I think in part through her example. She prays daily. She believes that God is speaking to her, and that God has a will for her and for all of these men. And she somehow manages, Mark Twain loves to write about this, to stop swearing. These are soldiers. These are scruffy men of the field in an age when there's not a lot of kind of, how do you survive for the most part as a soldier? By taking what you need as you travel on the road. I mean, these are, shall we call them soldiers, or shall we call them brigands? And she takes these men and basically says, shape up. We've got a moral mission here, and we are going to win by being right. And so I think some of it's all of those things. Yeah.
Wonderful. So this is a very interesting question. Assuming that Joan saw the Burgundians as French traitors, since they sided with the English, did she ever cast a public judgment on them? Or how did she address them in general?
She's very, very good about trying not to demonize the enemy. I mean, she's asked, they ask her questions all the time during her trial about her opinion of those that were loyal with the Burgundians, and frankly also about whether or not God could be on the side of both sides. What voice, what language, for example, she's asked, did the saints speak to you in? And she responds, Katharine spoke to me in French because she's on the side of the French. I mean, she's just quite insistent. So I think her feeling wasn't that, that the enemy was mistaken. I mean, she very famously said she holds no animus against the English. She very much wants them to enjoy their own home. They should go home and live a better life. I mean, she puts it in these sorts of terms again and again. So I think that's a part of what's charming about her. She's really not partisan overtly. She's instead a woman that believes quite insistently that God wants France to be a nation of the French people, meaning Valois. I mean, it has a particular kind of political meaning at that moment.
Thank you. So we've had a question about why St. Catherine and St. Margaret specifically, along with St. Michael. Is there an explanation for the specific nature of that?
I think those are much debated. I mean, and her cult, her association, her devotion to these saints takes a variety of forms. She has these voices that appear to her while she's still in Domremy. And then as she goes along, for example, she has a vision, or a voice tells her to seek her sword, the sword at the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. Fierbois is a village not that far from Domremy. She doesn't go herself. Instead, she tells people where to go, and they find the sword beneath the altar stone behind the altar. And that's one of the sort of first miracles associated with Joan of Arc, that the vision told her of an ancient sword, the sword that would be hers, and the sword that was indeed found. So some of it could simply be, the church to St. Margaret. There's another church to St. Margaret not so far away. Is it simply that? It's possible. But these are also saints that are martyrs. These are saints that are prayed to by women. St. Margaret is associated with childbirth. So any pious woman that is, hoping for a normal life would know to pray to Margaret, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and we don't have a single answer, but.
Well, it's very striking, the very personal relationship that she has with her saints. As it's depicted in the trial transcript, they really are, it's these saints and not other saints, and they come to her, and she really seems to have an ongoing relationship with them in a very personal way.
They inspire her, and their sacrifice inspires her. Yeah.
So we've had a question about the the relationship between Joan and the United States. So what is distinctive about American views of Joan? And as a related question, what do you think is the most, what's your favorite depiction of Joan in the States?
Well, I have a lot of favorite pictures of Joan of Arc in the United States, but my current passion right now are the paintings at the National Gallery of Art. They used to be at the Corcoran. It's a cycle of paintings of Joan of Arc's life, and they are wonderful. And some of the pictures that I showed you today, that very opening, if I dare share my screen again, the opening picture that I showed you, slide number 1, let's see if we can pull it up, is an example of Boutet de Monval's pictures. Oops, hang on. Let's see, am I sharing? Yes, I hope I'm sharing. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a painting by Boutet de Monval, and it's one of 6 paintings that he did of Joan of Arc. And this is the famous scene where he picks her out. He picks the Dauphin out among the courtiers, where he's sort of hiding among them, looking humble, while everyone else looks much more splendid. But what was the question about Joan of Arc in America?
What's your your favorite image of her, and what's distinctive about American views? Is there some different way in which Americans see her versus, say, the French or even the English?
Well, I think in certain ways for the Americans, she's less fraught. You know, for the French, she's associated with Catholicism, which you know, France has, after the Revolution, became very secularized. So for some, you know, can she be a universal heroine? Can she represent everybody? If not everybody wants to insist that you have to be Catholic. And even if you're a Catholic, you don't necessarily want to insist that everyone else be Catholic. I think Americans don't have that problem, you know, because we weren't historically founded as or regarded ourselves ever as a wholly Catholic nation. So I think for a lot of Americans, Joan of Arc can be a figure of courage, simply, a figure simply of virtue, if she's going to be those things. And a symbol also, she was an important symbol in the 19th and 20th century for Americans of what France and our relationship with France represented. And that is a symbol of people that honor the people, that are for the commoner, that as opposed to a monarchist, which is sort of funny given that Joan of Arc helps to put a prince on the throne as king, but she's also a figure that represents how the common person can do amazing things, and how the common man or woman can change the world. And I think she represents all of that. So yeah, I mean, I think she's, you know, here in Washington, D.C., there's really a terrific statue of Joan of Arc in Meridian Hill Park, of Joan of Arc with her sword, kind of inspired, and she looks like a girl. She looks like a little girl on a big horse with a sword and a sense of purpose. And there's something terrifically inspiring about that, you know, it's not how big you are, it's not how physically strong you are, it's how strong your convictions are, that I think Joan of Arc represents. But that sculpture, by the way, was a gift of France to America to thank us for saving them in World War I, for stepping in and helping them. And I think it's represented over time also in affiliation with other countries. So yeah, anyway, that's another great Joan of Arc image here in America.
And I actually learned recently that the driving force behind the establishment of Meridian Hill Park was woman.
Oh, lovely.
A very influential society hostess who basically had that whole area developed and created the park. So perhaps there's not a coincidence there as well. Mm-hmm. So I think we have time for one last question, and this comes from across the pond again, from Scotland. So this is from a final year PhD student who is researching the life of Brother Walfrid, who founded the Celtic Football Club in Glasgow. Walfrid was part of the Marist Brothers male religious teaching order, founded in France in 1817. And Michael asks, given the revival of interest in Joan of Arc in the 1840s, do you think this is part of a shift towards the feminine in devotion in the 19th century church, particularly in France?
Well, that wouldn't be the first shift towards the feminine. I mean, obviously, if you look at medieval imagery, you'll know that the shift to the feminine began long before. But I think there is a very important cult of the kind of girl saint, young, innocent child that Joan of Arc taps into. I think we'd already spoken about that before. Uh-oh, I think hang on. Did I freeze for a moment there?
Just for a moment, but you're back.
Yeah.
So do you see anything in any kinship between this devotion to Joan and, say, Saint Bernadette and,
Oh yeah.
visions? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, completely. And Saint Teresa and Lourdes. And no, there's a tremendous emphasis on these kind of miraculous interventions in the 19th century. And they focus on these kind of childlike figures that are very young, very innocent, women or women and a child at La Salette. I mean, there's lots of instances of this. Yeah. That's its own kind of wonderful, fascinating subject. Should be fun to explore sometime.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending today. Many thanks, particularly to Dr. Nora Heimann for a wonderful and insightful lecture and conversation. We invite you to listen to this conversation and past IHE events on our YouTube channel. Please visit our website, ihe.catholic.edu, for information about the Civitas Dei program and other exciting IHE initiatives. And please visit honors.catholic.edu to learn more about the University Honors Program at Catholic. Thank you to you all, and have a wonderful day, and happy Feast of Saint Joan in advance.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Paxton, so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone with the IHE that sponsored this, and to all of the audience that came today. I loved your wonderful questions. They were great.